Hello, hello, hello. This is Lumper from Largely Mediocre Gaming, here to bring everybody a bit more Kerbal Space Program. I know last episode I said I was going to be doing aquatic based things, but unfortunately I've not quite managed to get things ready yet. I'm still, testing ideas and working out different mechanics. But next episode is going to be then our super fun special water episode, where I'll show you like water-based planes and how to build a boat and maybe even try and launch something from the ocean. And then we're going to try and get a big pirate ship into space. So that's what's coming next episode. But I haven't had time to get that ready, so I will show you what I have got completed in the meantime. So first of all, we do have the beginnings of our space station up. Let's go and check that out. As you can see, pretty standard fare. We've got some fuel tanks here ready to get filled up, and then we can refuel things. Big old tank of monopropellant. Batteries. At this point this is basically just like a storage station, so it's just got loads of like containers for different types of fuel and electricity and generators and all that sort of neat stuff. And then once you've sort of got it all up and running, I can use this to refuel, and then when we do missions to other planets, this will be really nice because it will be able to refuel all our things in orbit, which is super helpful. So that's that, but there's a lot more to add on yet. I need to do like a place for crew to stay, and then maybe some sort of large docking array. I might add another one of these sort of fuel modules. I plan on making this basically quite a big modular space station where everything can sort of connect in multiple layers to everything else, and we can keep attaching more and more of everything. That's the ideal, but this is just the beginning. But that's not what I'm going to show you properly this episode, because that's not interesting. You come to me for cool stuff. What I'm going to show you instead is an SSTO plane. This is fairly standard, of course. I mean, there's loads of things online showing you how to make single stage to orbit, but when I was trying to do this, I really struggled. And I think part of the issue was, whenever I went through a tutorial online, they all showed you their design and how to fly what they'd already built, and sort of the logic behind their process, but not how to build one yourself, and not sort of the underlying principles. So what I'm going to do this episode is walk you through in excruciating, boring detail exactly how to build a decent functioning single stage to orbit spaceplane. Now, because I know it works, I'm going to use this design, and I don't want to be mucking around with a design that then ultimately doesn't work and I've given you bad advice. So this is what our end goal is going to be, a little plane called the Strato Smasher. I've named it because stratosphere, whatever. I'm not good at naming things in this game. But, as you can see, we've got 2 turbojet engines, 1 aerospike, we've got different control surfaces, we've got 4 air intakes, and I'll explain the logic behind that. And we've got an incline clampetron, so it's pretty simple. There's not too many parts, but for now let's clear this and get building a new one. So I'll click new. So first of all, you're going to decide what cockpit you want when you're building your SSTO. You've basically got 3 choices because you want to build a plane, not a ship. So you've got the Mark 1 cockpit, which is the one I've chosen. Well, I say advantage, this one is actually probably the worst of the 3 cockpits. They've all got the same sort of reaction wheels, but these 2 you can attach things in front, so you can sort of fit them more snugly into a nice design, whereas this one has to be the top thing because it doesn't have any forward attachment points. But the cool thing about this one is it does have a really cool view from inside the cockpit. So if you ever want to try and land your plane from inside the cockpit, which I have nearly done a couple of times, and which is sort of a fun challenge to give yourself, this is the one you want to use. I also just think it looks nicest. I'm going to stick on an inline clampetron just because later on I'm going to develop this into something that can sort of maneuver a bit better in space, ideally. And then now we're going to get into the fuel. So because you're making a single stage to orbit, you actually need 2 different types of fuel. You're going to need jet fuel for your engines while you're in the atmosphere, which is what you need these fuselages for. and you're going to need normal rocket fuel for once you're going out of the atmosphere to power your rockets up, to sort of take you out. Now I'm only using one normal rocket in this, so we're going to stick on a nice big rocket fuel and tank in the middle, and then one more after that, because I needed slightly more than this one tank gives to get into orbit, I found when I was testing this out. So that's the principle there. Then you want to choose your rocket engine. Now there's basically two options here, only two, nothing else is going to really work. The nuclear engine and the toroidal aerospike rocket. The reason that these are your only two options is because they are basically the most efficient, and efficiency is the name of the game in an SSTO. You will only barely be making it to orbit. Even if you make a really, really good design, the physics and the mechanics of it are so close to the wire that unless you're building some sort of huge mothership, it's going to be really, really difficult to get it up. So you want something quite efficient. I'm sticking with the toroidal aerospike because, again, I know it works and because it is a lot more powerful. So basically the decision you need to make is preferably use a nuclear engine because it's more efficient, but if you need more power because you're using a slightly heavier ship, toroidal is the way to go. So test that out when you're making your own SSTO and sort of work it out as best as possible. Now, as you saw earlier, I have some wing connectors on, so before we go any further, I need to bring up my centre of mass and my centre of lift. This is the really, really tricky part about building any plane in Kerbal Space Program, but especially in SSTO, because you're going to be going so high up in the atmosphere. Sorry about that, we just had someone knocking on my door. So where was I? Oh yes, aerodynamics. So you want enough lift obviously to help you get off the ground, so you do need quite a few wings, but keep it simple. That is the big issue I've had with these bloody SSTOs, is trying to just keep the whole thing as simple as possible, and it's a nightmare. So this is roughly where you want your lift marker to be. You'll notice it points slightly forward. At first I thought this is some problem with my designs when I was making planes, but they have just patched that recently, and now the lift will always point slightly forward instead of straight up like it should. So if you see, it's pointing towards the tip rather than straight up. I think that makes it more stable. That might be why they've patched that. Just a sort of quick, simple fix. It may well have always been that way. I only started making planes quite recently. So this is where you're trying to keep your lift. The reason for that is, if it is in front of your centre of mass, then you will sort of flip. Your craft will keep trying to bring its nose up, and then you will keep flipping and crashing, and there's no way to control it. So you want it slightly behind and inside, because the closer it is, obviously the more stable the craft is. I mean, if it's further back, it'll also be pushing your nose down. So as close as possible to the centre of mass, but slightly behind. That also is helpful because the fuel tanks will gradually empty as you use up fuel, and that will generally bring your centre of mass back slightly. So there's a risk of, in the middle of your flight, the centre of mass will be slowly shifting, and then it will move way too far behind the centre of lift, and you'll flip over. So that is where you're trying to keep your centre of lift at all times. Next, we're going in to our fuselages, and we're picking out jet fuel. I'm using slightly more fuel than I need, if I'm honest. Doesn't want to connect them though. Could have an issue here. Yeah, it doesn't seem to want to connect these. That's rather irritating. Oh, there we go. Suddenly worked. I'm using more fuel than I need. Really, you should have as little fuel as possible. Perhaps one Mark 1 fuselage for each engine. That's just a rough rule of thumb. You might need slightly more, but really use as little fuel just to keep the weight down and make everything easier. Now we're going to stick on the rest of our aerodynamics now that we've got that sort of structure in place. I'm using a delta wing. Of course, you can pretty much use whatever you want. It's not a huge issue. You'll notice I'm now allowing the centre of lift to move slightly back. That's fine because I'll be putting different control surfaces on and things later, and that should shift it back into the position I want. So you've got these delta wings here, that's just for a bit extra lift. Then we want some control surfaces to allow ourselves to pivot. So let's have one on the back of this wing. If I can remember how to do it, there we go. Want one on the back of that wing. I'm also going to put one on the front. And then I'm going to go over a bit of control surface logic. So, as you'll know, when you're piloting something in Kerbal Space Program, and to an extent in real life, there are basically 3 different axes that you're trying to control. The first is yaw, which is from side to side, so turning your ship around like that, side to side. The second is your pitch, so your up and down control. This is especially important in space planes. And the final one is roll, so tipping your ship around. I can't really show that with the camera because it doesn't turn inside here, but that's when you'd be bringing this right engine up and this left engine down, so it sort of rolls around on its own middle axis. So that is basically what you need to be bearing in mind when you're creating control surfaces, is that the further something is along the axis that it's tilting, the more of a torque it will exert. That's sort of a really stupid way of phrasing it, but for example, to control the pitch, so the up and down movement, you're going to be exerting a force up and down. Now, if you've done any GCSE physics, something like that, you'll remember that if you have a pivot point, the further away you can apply a force, the sort of more effective it is, the more torque you get. In this case, the pivot point will be our centre of mass, because we're not attached to anything. We'll be in midair, so the ship will ideally pivot around the centre of mass. That means that when you're trying to change lift, you want something as far forward or as far back as possible from this centre of lift. So I'm going to be sticking these canards on to control exactly that. And you can see the further forward I bring them, the lift moves forward, but also it will mean I'll get more force for my buck when I'm using these later. There we go, let's stick that on there. So, because they're so far forward, they will now be able to generate a much stronger control over my pitch on this craft. Now, what's next? The same also applies, of course, to roll. So ideally for a roll surface, you want it as far out on the side as possible. So out on the tip of this wing or out on the tip of that wing on the left. And then, of course, for a yaw surface, you want it as far backward or forward as possible as well. So either on your nose cone or right at the back on your tail, somewhere here. Because I don't have a tail, I'm just going to be sticking a winglet as far back as I can sort of reasonably get it, which is somewhere there. And I'm going to stick another pair on here because I need a bit more yaw control for this. And if I recall, in this design I didn't really have much roll control on the tip. That's why we've got these control surfaces next to the wing connectors here. So that should be our aerodynamics. And I hope you sort of understand, roughly how to put your control surfaces. Bear in mind, basically you want them as far away from the centre of mass as possible, and you're aiming to get as much torque as you can from those control surfaces. So our next point is the air intakes. This is where SSTOs get a bit tricky. So basically, I'll show you the engines first, in fact, because then it will make this lesson a bit easier. You've got 2 different types of engine if you're trying to build a jet, the turbojet and the basic jet. The difference between them, which is roughly reflective of real life, is that the basic jet engine is more efficient at lower altitudes. As you can see, the specific impulse, the ISP, is higher at sea level than it is in a vacuum. It goes from 2000 and then it drops to 1000 as you go up through the atmosphere. The turbojet engine, by contrast, starts at 800 and then goes up and becomes more efficient in a vacuum at 1200. Now that's only a slight difference, but it will make you a lot more powerful when we get into the upper atmosphere. The only time you'd ever need a basic jet engine is if you need a bit more power in the lower atmosphere just to get yourself up, which you shouldn't. If you're needing a basic jet engine to get off the ground, you're doing it wrong. You should only ever need turbojets. So let's stick these on if the game engine will let me. Doesn't seem to be wanting to play ball today for some reason. There's a lot of weird part clipping in these designs, it's really quite annoying. Come on. There we go. Let me pull this back. So that's dragged my mass a bit off, but we'll deal with that in a moment. Now, these jet engines are super efficient and relatively powerful for that efficiency. I mean, if you see here, the ISP of the nuclear motor even, which is pretty much the highest of all the normal rocket engines, is only 800 at the best of days, whereas these sort of start off at better than that and then only get more efficient as you go on. So they are very efficient in their use of fuel, but the trade-off is that they need air. You need an actual intake of air. And as you go higher in the atmosphere, of course, the air gets thinner. So you will eventually run out of air to sort of breathe for your engines, and then they will cut out, you'll lose control, and you'll crash into the sea and your Kerbals will die. We don't want that, so we want an air intake like this one. Again, here you've got a few different choices. You've got the engine nacelle, which is useful because it's sort of an inline air intake. So if you just want like a structural component, or you're considering using a structural fuselage, always use one of these, because then you get slightly more air intake at no real cost to yourself. I mean, it's also got relatively low drag, so that's one option. Then you've got these radial air intakes, which are helpful because you can put them on the outside of an engine, so you can stack up absolutely loads of these. The trade-off there though is they're quite heavy. You've got this normal circular intake, which if I take that off I can show you. It goes on the front, takes in air. This is more efficient at lower sort of heights, lower in thicker atmosphere, as are the nacelle and the radial intake. So to get into the high atmosphere, which is what you want in a single stage orbit after all, you want to use this ram air intake, which is much more efficient at higher altitudes. It'll keep bringing in more intake air. Now the problem is, even using that, you in general won't be able to get too high before you run out of intake air, and then your engines flame out and you haven't got enough speed to get you into orbit. So what the community sort of realised at some point was that rather than using these radial air intakes or these engine nacelles the way you're supposed to try and get more air intake, there are various ways of clipping parts together so that you just use absolutely loads of ram air intakes, because these are the best ones, so why settle for anything less, basically. I've seen people do a few different tricks to pull that off. The most common one is to get get rid of that. So get one of these cubic octagonal struts, stick a ram air engine on the front, and then tilt it round so it's facing forward, and then you can just build like loads. There's people who've made like 20 ram air intakes on their tiny space plane by just stacking loads and loads onto their wing. I don't think that looks very nice though, and I'm all about aesthetics when I'm playing Kerbal Space Program. So we're going to use this massive adapter, which looks kind of butt ugly, but at least seems kind of realistic. And then just plonk on a bunch of air intakes. Now we have 4 intakes for each engine, which is about where I want to be. If I can get this one to attach, it doesn't seem to want to. There we go. You want at least 2 for each engine. Ideally you want 3 or even 4 air intakes, ram air intakes, for each of your turbojet engines. Anything less than that is fairly inefficient. You want to get as high as possible. Really, you just want as many of these as you can get on. If you can get 20 of these for each of your turbojet engines somehow, do so, by all means. Get as many ram air intakes as you possibly can onto your ship, and it will be able to fly higher in the atmosphere. That's the long and the short of it. Now, of course, our centre of lift and our centre of mass have become a bit screwed up by all this fiddling around we've done. So I'll be adjusting the wings in just a moment. So there you go. As you can see, once again we've got our centre of lift just behind but still inside of the orb of the centre of mass. That's what you're going for every time. Oh, let's fix these wings. They seem to have decided to do their own thing. They can go their own way. So feel free to steal this design. I'm not entirely sure how people put up links to their part files yet. I need to figure out how to do that, and I can show you, sort of start sharing these weird designs. Only thing left to do now is attach some under what they called things, gear bays. This is quite another actual this is another teachable point, as it were. So when you're designing these wheels, they are a lot more important than you might initially expect. You want essentially as wide of a wheelbase as you possibly can get to increase your stability on takeoff, because any slight wobble, any slight deviation that you have at takeoff is going to absolutely screw with you as this flight goes on, because it's only just going to exacerbate itself and get worse and worse. So you want as stable as possible, a nice wide wheelbase, and then stick another one on the front. Part of me thinks I should probably use more at the front and just keep it as stable as possible. I can't remember if I did for the Stratobuster, but I'm not going to check. So, if I can't think of anything else, I'm pretty sure this is just about our final design. I think I do. No, I want an engine bank, or battery bank or something to store a bit of charge for us to use. I'll stick that on there. The game is not playing ball with me today in terms of part clipping. It wants to stop me doing anything. There we go. That battery bank is just so the SAS won't run out, which would be super irritating while we're in orbit. I need to be able to control it. Another thing to bear in mind when you're putting the wheels on, you want the one at the front to be slightly lower down than the one at the back. That means that it will tilt your craft slightly upward and give you a slight angle of attack while you're on the runway. You want that so that you'll be generating a bit of a upward force, because otherwise you're going to just be going straight forward, fall off the end of the runway and hit the ground, and you won't be going upwards fast enough to stop yourself from falling. But if I haven't forgot anything, which I don't think I have, this is our final craft. This is what we're going to be flying. Before you do that though, you've got one more thing to sort out, and that is the action groups. So action groups are basically a way of binding different controls and parts of your ship to different keys on your keyboard. A few are done automatically for you. For example, the gear bays automatically just all go under the gear action group, which you can control with G, and which appears on your HUD. They also go into the brakes action group, your small gear bay. The SS and RCS you don't really need to control because they're done for you. All things like these are sort of all done automatically for you. So you need to make a custom one though for your engines, so you can control them once you're in flight. You're going to be turning things off and on a lot. So with one of your custom groups, you want to put toggle engine on for your main rocket engines, all of them. Unless you're doing something a bit more finesse, but in general put all your rocket engines onto one custom group, and then the other custom group do all of your normal jet engines, your turbojet engines. So the reason you're doing that is because when you're flying a SSTO, you'll be switching between your turbojet engines and your rocket boost engines at least twice, and then when you re-enter you'll be switching between different things again. That's basically the reasoning there. And you might want to fit in an abort group, like if you're trying to keep your Kerbal alive, which I'm not too concerned about because I'm just going to use the disposable one. I'm going to use some random idiot. You put in an abort group so you can like eject and keep your Kerbal nice and safe. I'm not going to bother. So we'll call this the SSTO demo craft. What a great name. That'll echo down the ages, that one will. We'll save that. We've got everything set up as far as I can tell. And now let's just pick a different crew person. Jeb died earlier. I don't like that they still come back, even with this new crew manifest thing that they've done. I don't like that Kerbal's come back. I want permadeath. Come on. Squad, get on it. That can't be too hard. Let's use our hero from the previous adventure, Phil Kerman. Let's save this little assembly and let's go to launch. I can show you how to pilot an SSTO in each different stage. So basically, we've got a few different stages to launching any SSTO, no matter what design you're using. Oh, I shouldn't have put the brakes on, oh well. Let's get daylight going here, because, you know, screw flying this thing at night. It's hard enough as it is. There we go, we can fly towards the sun. It'll be a nice view. So you've got a few different stages. The first one, which we're, as you might guess, about to engage in, is the launch. And you've got a few things to check before you get started. First of all, you do want to be doing it in daytime, just to make it easier for yourself. You know, there's no reason to make this more challenging than it already is. Keep your resources tab up. Make sure you do not have the sensitive controls enabled. So you want this little HUD orange, meaning that you can make like strong pitch adjustments, which you'll need to do. Then engage your engines and immediately use your control group before you throttle up or do anything to turn off your rocket engine, so it won't activate when you launch, which would waste fuel and ruin your day. So now you've got just your jet engines on. You want to be rolling slightly forward. Don't bother putting the brakes on. That used to be the way of thinking, but it was stupid. Don't yet, I've found, enable SAS. At this stage, just throttle up and get some forward momentum going. So once you're going a bit faster, then you turn your SAS on, because you'll be sort of straightened out a bit and you can have made any adjustments yourself without the SAS screwing it up. This plane I actually have to go off the end of the runway, but ideally you'd be using a design where you can tilt up to some point on the runway. So now that we've taken off successfully, I think we're pretty much going in a straight line. I have not yet managed to launch a space plane and go in a decent straight line, but hey, I'm sure I can sort that out at some point. Okay, we're back. I was having an issue there. The forward control surface wasn't quite properly attached, so it was glitching out and giving me sort of weird issues where this little surface here between my air intakes and my attachment point, those ones weren't properly tilting, which was giving me various issues. I've now switched over to using the Strato Smasher, my original design, and we're going to... I'll show you through the rest of these stages using that. So, as before, resources tab up, engines engage, rocket turn off, don't activate SAS yet, roll forward slightly, build up a bit of speed, and then I can turn the SAS on when I get to about 100 or something. The reason you don't want to turn the SAS on is because it has a tendency to make stupid adjustments while you're still on the runway. I mean, I'd rather drift off slightly, and as long as I go off the end, yeah, we're fine. Okay, so now I can pitch up. I can show you what I actually meant to show you before, which is, yeah, here we go. You pitch right up. Don't let the angle of your ship get too far different from the yellow prograde marker, because if you do, you'll flip. So I hold it at about 85 and then let it drop, and then the SAS will keep us there. There we go, good. This is why you need SAS. It is much better at managing pitch than you are. So you want some sort of SAS equipped. Luckily all the cockpits now have them as standard, which is helpful as hell. I'm quite glad the squad did that, even though I hate the new SAS in every other respect. So this is how we should have been climbing before. And I will now cut here, and you will rejoin me when we are a bit closer to cruising altitude. So we're coming in soon to my cruising altitude for this plane, which is somewhere around 10,000. Yeah, there we go. So every SSTO will have some point at which your intake air starts to drop quite drastically during your climb, because you're not taking in enough air, because you're going through a thinner part of the atmosphere. At this stage then you need to tilt down quite heavily, and this is now the third sort of stage. Oh, I haven't brought the gears in yet. This is now the third stage of our SSTO flight, which is the slow ascent. So you've been climbing so far, and now we're trying to change out, level out slightly. Need to pull up slightly more than that though. No, okay, right, I'm going to go to 25. The new SAS makes it so much harder than it used to be. Jesus. Right, there we go. There we go. So you're going to be climbing a lot more gently now, so that you're not losing SAS as well. Hold on, I need to tilt my plane. Ugh, which is a nightmare in this. Right, okay, there we go. So level out a lot more, climb only a lot more gently, so that you're not losing your intake air quite so rapidly. In my case, I will actually begin to dip slightly to use up more fuel as well, because I've got so much extra fuel on this design that I need to sort of use it up if possible and build up a bit more speed at lower altitudes. So now you're doing your slow climb. As you can see, I'm still losing intake air. Normally you would just keep ascending from this point, but I've got so much extra fuel that I'm going to dip down slightly and try and use some of that up. If you start getting these red reentry effects, as that you can now see on my cockpit, don't worry, it's just because you're going very fast and you're still in relatively thick atmosphere. I've still yet to make one that will break the sound barrier lower down. I think you might need basic jet engines to pull that one off. So I'm going to just keep climbing. You'll see I'm still gaining altitude at a rate of knots, as it were. So keep leveling off if possible. You want to be just about climbing. Ideally there would be a way of keeping your plane perfectly level, or your prograde vector at least perfectly level, so that you're not climbing at all. You can just stay at like your ideal altitude, but it's really hard to control. This is, this is not a flight simulator game. This is a rocket simulator game. They don't really have that sort of degree of finesse built into it. I'm gonna tilt down a bit now to try and stop myself from climbing any higher. I would like to gain back some of my intake air, which I'm doing. Lovely. I'm about to start gaining some of that back. So I might go through a few cycles of sort of dipping back down and then trying to come back up again. You'll see at this point we're going over 1,000 meters per second. I mean, that's like sort of rocket speeds we're going now. To put it into perspective, if I look at some of my orbiting space stations, 2,200 is probably the bare minimum you're looking at for a low Kerbal orbit. As you get out further, obviously you don't need to go quite so fast. So the point of this sort of stage now, which I'm going to call the cruising stage, even though technically I'm descending and I'll get to properly cruising a bit later, is just to build up speed while you're in the atmosphere using your super efficient jet engines. Because as you can see, look, we've been going for ages now and we've used perhaps 150 fuel. That's insane. We've used so little fuel for the distance we've come and the speed we're going at. It's absolutely insane. That's why the jet engines are so useful. You can see over here on my intake air bar, I'm now gaining back intake air because we're in thicker atmosphere. Once that gets full again, I'll begin pulling up again. I just wanted to use up some fuel and get maybe a bit more speed built up. It's also advantageous because I started losing intake air, if you'll recall, at something like 10,000 meters, because I was climbing pretty much straight up, and then I had to level out, and I was already about halfway out of intake air by the time I'd found the proper ascent angle. So now by going back down again, I not only use up this massive amount of excess fuel that I have and get down to my other engines, I also can get intake air at a slightly more efficient rate. I mean, I'll probably hit 12,000 and be at a better angle once I've got full intake air. So I'll have a bit more than I had initially, if that makes any sense to anyone except me. I phrased it really badly, but the point is I should probably have a bit more intake air than I had when I was first coming up. That's the plan anyway. As you can see, we slowed down a hell of a lot. We were going over 1,000 at some point, and now we're going to mere 500 meters per second. We're still going pretty damn fast. Okay, we're back basically to full intake air. I'm going to begin to pull up again. Let's tilt this up to angle 20 and drop it back down, and that should bring up our pitch enough. Yep, you can see in the HUD up here there's the altimeter with that little red meter sign next to it, and then to the right of that is a little dial showing your rate of ascension. If you can't see that particularly clearly, you can go into your cockpit view using C, and you can get a much better look at these dials, so you can see a bit more precisely how fast you're going. Vertical speed, altimeter, your altitude according to radar, so that's how far you are above actual ground, and atmosphere, and so on. But enough of that, out we go. So now I'm cruising a bit more properly. This is how I should really be. This is the proper cruise, as it were. And I want to be just very slowly gaining altitude. That is the plan. You want to be gaining altitude as slowly as you can, and that will also accelerate you, is the idea. So yeah, because you go up into thinner atmosphere, but you're going as horizontal as possible so that your horizontal speed is improving, is ideal. This will also give you the sort of maximum opportunity to use your engines, because if you're going too fast you'll sort of run out of atmosphere before you've built up enough speed, whereas if you're going more horizontal than you are upward, so yeah, you want to be going horizontally faster than you're going upward so that you have more time in the atmosphere. I will be cutting out so much of this because I just repeat myself. This is going to be really awkward to edit. Jesus. I need to stop saying Jesus. Right, so you're back with us. We are now hitting over 20,000. At some point soon I'm going to start running out of useful atmosphere for my engines. That's what's going to happen. So I'm going to start getting this a bit more steady, and then we're going to at some point boost in my rocket engine when I get to about 0.3. I'm going to bring in my rocket engine back online using the action groups we set up earlier. I could also just click on it, that's probably a bit safer because I can't quite remember the action groups as well as I probably think I can. 0.3, bam, here we go. I'm going to bring in the engine. The purpose of that is to bring yourself a lot more forward momentum, or forward velocity I should say, which then means that your jet engines last you longer, because the faster you go forward, the more air you take in. The more air you take in, the longer the jet engines can function for. The longer the jet engines can function for, the more speed you can build up while you're still inside the atmosphere, which is exactly what we need to do. Keep yourself steady with a few minor adjustments if you have to. Keep an eye on my oxidizer because I'm going to need at least half of this to sort of stabilise in orbit. So once I get a bit lower than this, I'm going to start pulling up. I want to at least break 2,000 meters per second before I cut off my engines. I can get down safely to about 0.1. Okay, let's cut off the jet engines now. I'm going to start pulling up with this engine. Now, don't pull up too hard, you will flip. You will completely flip your engine, which is far from freaking ideal, as you can imagine. I'm going to switch into map view, in fact, so I can keep an eye on my Apoapsis. That's high enough, probably. Cut out my engine, 106, yeah. I can always sort of burst up again if I need to keep it up. I'm still quite low in the atmosphere, but this should maybe make it out. No, I might need a bit more. So, essentially the point here is to, this is your next stage. Once you've established as much speed as possible inside the atmosphere, you're pulling up and using your rocket to get you out of the atmosphere. You're basically switching over from plane mode to rocket mode. The most efficient way of getting out of the atmosphere, of course, is to go straight up. So you want to point your rocket upward as much as possible. The issue with that is that if you point straight upward, you'll flip your craft, because it's still a plane and it's still got all sorts of aerodynamic crap going on. So you can't point quite straight upward, you need to point sort of as upward as you can safely do so without completely like fucking up your ship. So I'm going to level out now and get myself pointed in the prograde marker here. This has gone relatively well in terms of stability, but I might not have been efficient enough with fuel to get orbit, I don't know. Now the Apoapsis, you want to basically be just above the atmosphere, is the most efficient way of doing it. Reasons for that are several. The first of all is obviously the higher you go out, the more fuel it's taken you to do so. So I mean, you want it just above 70,000, anywhere between 70 and 80 should be okay. I'll probably be a bit too high. But if I get it up to like 100,000, say, then I've wasted fuel doing that, when I don't need to go that high to be outside of the atmosphere, do I? To, you know, to establish an orbit. The second reason is something called the Oberth effect, which is basically to do with orbital mechanics. And it essentially means that in terms of velocity, you get more bang for your delta V buck, as it were, the closer you are into a planet. Now, this has a trade-off with the fact that the lower your orbit is, the faster you need to go. So, you know, obviously it's a bit easier. You take less delta V to amp up if you are on a wider orbit. But all in all, it's slightly more easy, shall I say, in terms of fuel to establish an orbit the lower down you do it, and then you can extend it out if you've got enough fuel later. Once you've got above the atmosphere, then you can extend it out as much as you want in your own time. But for now, I need to keep myself pointed down at this prograde marker. The music, as you can hear, has kicked in, which means we are above the atmosphere. Woo. Obviously no intake air, we're in a vacuum. So all we have now is, we've got plenty of liquid fuel left, kind of irritatingly. This is what I mean about me having way too much of it. And we have some liquid fuel in our tank, but the main thing to keep an eye on is your oxidizer, because liquid fuel includes the jet fuel. So I've got this much oxidizer left, and we have 1 minute to Apoapsis. This is obviously the final stage of our single stage to orbit flight. So we've had our takeoff, our climb, our slow climb, a cruise to build up speed in the atmosphere, then a final rocket climb to get out of the atmosphere, and now we're about to try and circularize and reach orbit once out of the atmosphere using our rocket. Those are the sort of stages of an SSTO. I didn't count that in my head, which I probably should have, so I could be like, oh, there's 7 stages of SSTO flight, but I didn't. So yeah, I think probably around about now I want to be perfectly level with the atmosphere, and then bam, throttle up, and let's hope we can achieve orbit. Oh yes we can. Okay, so to be as efficient as possible, obviously you want to be dead on the Apoapsis, otherwise you're wasting oxidizer. Now this is the great thing about having built up so much speed inside the atmosphere, is that we're suborbital, but we're going ridiculously fast. I mean, we're going already 2,168 meters per second. So if I can get up to about 2,200 delta V, we'll already be in orbit. We don't need that much delta V now to get ourselves circularized properly. So this is the point of building up all that speed in orbit instead of going straight upward. And I think I've done this even more efficiently than I did last time. I'm very pleased with this. Let's wait until we're about 5 seconds or something out of the Apoapsis. This doesn't look like it'll be a very long burn. We just need to get our periapsis out of the atmosphere, then we're fine. Okay, let's burn it up again. Up we go. And I'll cut this out the moment it's above 70. There we go. If you didn't know, X cuts out your engine immediately, so it saves you wasting time throttling down or trying to guess anything. So we now have an orbit with 120 oxidizer left to spare. That is plenty enough to circularize this, bring it out a bit further. I could maybe meet up with our satellite or our space station. I should probably save it though to make sure I've got plenty enough to come back into orbit, into the atmosphere. But here we go. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you get an SSTO from construction all the way into orbit. Every single step. I sort of conceived of this as a very detailed guide where I could go over all the steps and try and explain everything in detail. I hope I've done so. If you have any recommendations, please go into the comments, inform me. You know, I'm not a master of this game by any stretch of the imagination. So let me know in the comments if you think I could have done anything better, if you've got any suggestions for the design. Go check out the blog. We've got some fun articles going on over there. We've been discussing exploration in video games, and I make reference to Kerbal Space Program. And everyone, please tune in next time for Largely Mediocre Gaming. I'm Lumper. This has been Kerbal Space Program. I see you all next time. Bye bye.